Welcome to Kiss and Chapters, where every story begins with a spark and ends with a swoon. If you love heart-fluttering romances, unexpected twists, and characters you'll root for, you're in the right place. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so I can keep bringing you more sweet, emotional, and unforgettable stories. Let's fall in love with every chapter, together.
Chapter 1. A Soul Out of Time. The last thing Eliza remembered was the sound of screeching tires, the blinding glare of headlights, and the sickening crunch of metal. Then nothing. A void of silence and pain. She awoke to the gentle scent of lavender and beeswax. The surface beneath her was impossibly soft, a cloud of down feathers. A hospital, she thought groggily. But the smell? Her eyelids fluttered open and confusion, cold and sharp, stabbed through the fading remnants of pain. She was not in a hospital. A canopy of deep blue velvet hung above her. Pale morning light filtered through a large window framed by heavy brocade curtains. The room was vast, filled with dark ornate furniture that gleamed in the soft light. A dressing table with a triptych mirror, a heavy mahogany wardrobe, a delicate escritoire. It was like waking up inside a museum exhibit. She tried to sit up, her body protesting with a deep, unfamiliar ache. She pushed back a weight of blankets and looked down at herself. A white linen nightgown with long sleeves and delicate embroidery. Hands that were similar to hers, yet paler, softer, the nails perfectly shaped. Panic began a frantic drumbeat in her chest. This is a dream. A very vivid, very weird dream. The door creaked open and a young woman in a gray dress and a white cap entered, carrying a tray. She started when she saw Eliza sitting up. "My lady. You're awake. Thank the heavens," the girl said, her voice a soft, respectful murmur. She set the tray down on a side table and bustled over. "How are you feeling? The physician said you took a nasty bump on the head when you fainted." Eliza could only stare. The accent was pure English, the dress a perfect replica of a servant's uniform from a Jane Austen adaptation. The girl looked at her with genuine concern. I fainted." Eliza's voice came out as a croak. It sounded strange to her own ears, a slightly higher pitch, more refined. "Yes, my lady. In the gallery yesterday afternoon. Don't you remember? You said you felt light-headed and then, down you went." The maid leaned closer. "Shall I fetch the physician back? You look quite pale." "No," Eliza said quickly, too quickly. She forced a smile. "No, I'm just a little disoriented. That's all." Her mind was racing. "Gallery, my lady? What is your name?" The maid's eyes widened in surprise, then filled with fresh pity. "Oh, the poor dear. It's Sarah, my lady. I've been your maid these 3 months past. Since you came to Ashworth Manor." She poured a cup of steaming liquid from a porcelain pot. "Here, some tea will help. I've brought some toast as well. Cook sent up the blackberry jam you're fond of." Eliza took the cup with trembling hands. The heat was real. The porcelain was real. This was no dream. This was a nightmare. Ashworth Manor. The name meant nothing to her. "Thank you, Sarah," she said, mimicking the formal tone. As Sarah moved to draw the curtains, Eliza caught her reflection in the window glass. She froze, the teacup rattling dangerously in its saucer. Staring back at her was a stranger. The face was heart-shaped with large, doe-like brown eyes framed by dark lashes. Hair the color of rich mahogany was braided over one shoulder. The features were delicate, pretty in a way that was utterly foreign. It was the face of a woman in her early 20s, but it was not her face. Eliza was 32 with laugh lines her friends called character, and a stubborn streak of gray at her temple she'd earned from all-night design deadlines. A cold, terrifying realization began to dawn. The accident. The void. Waking up here. Transmigration. Isekai. The terms from the novels she'd read and shows she'd binge-watched flashed through her mind, absurd and terrifying. It was impossible. It was the only explanation. She was in someone else's body. In the past. "Sarah," she whispered, her voice trembling. What is today's date?" "Why, it's Tuesday, my lady," Sarah said, fluffing a pillow. "No, I mean, the year." Sarah gave her a look of deep concern. "It's 1813, my lady. Are you sure you wouldn't like me to fetch the physician?" 1813, Regency England. The air left Eliza's lungs. She set the tea down before she dropped it. She needed to get a grip. She needed information. She was clearly Lady Eleanor, and she had apparently taken a fall and lost her memory. It was a cliché, but it was the only shield she had. No, it's coming back to me slowly, Eliza lied. Please, Sarah, could you remind me? My role here. I feel so foolish. Sarah, eager to help, nodded. Your Lady Eleanor Reed, my lady. Your companion to Her Grace, the Dowager Duchess Amelia. You're here as a favor to your family, the Earl of Chisholm. Sarah's tone suggested the favor was more for the Earl's benefit than the Dowager's. You've been ever so quiet and helpful. Her Grace is quite fond of you. A companion. A quiet, overlooked spinster. Of course. Eliza's modern, independent soul recoiled at the idea. But it was a position of observation, of blending in. It might be her only salvation. An hour later, washed, dressed, and laced into a corset that felt like an instrument of torture, Eliza was following Sarah's directions to the morning room. The dress she wore was a simple, pale lavender muslin, high-waisted and long-sleeved. Felt like a costume. She walked through corridors lined with portraits of stern-looking men and delicate women. The air was heavy with the smell of polish, old wood, and money. Her heart hammered against the restrictive bones of her stays. She had to play this part. She had to be Eleanor. Timid, quiet, forgettable Eleanor. She entered the sunny morning room. An older woman with sharp, intelligent eyes and a kind smile sat at a small table sipping tea. This had to be the Dowager Duchess. She was dressed in elegant grey silk. Eleanor, my dear, the Dowager said. You are up. I was so worried. How is your head? Eliza dipped into the curtsy she'd seen in movies, hoping it was passable. It is much improved, Your Grace. Thank you for your concern. Nonsense, child, come sit. The tea is still hot. As Eliza sat, the Dowager studied her. You know, you look different this morning. There's a new light in your eyes. Perhaps that knock did you some good. Before Eliza could formulate a response, the door opened again. The air in the room changed, grew stiller, heavier. A man walked in. He was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in impeccably tailored buff-colored breeches, top boots, and a dark blue coat that stretched across his shoulders. His hair was dark brown, swept back from a high forehead, and his features were starkly handsome. A strong jaw, a straight nose, and eyes the color of a winter storm, gray and cool and utterly penetrating. He was without doubt the most breathtaking man Eliza had ever seen. He was also the most intimidating. Mother, he said, his voice a deep, resonant baritone that vibrated through Eliza. He barely glanced in her direction. Leonard, good morning, the Dowager said cheerfully. You remember Lady Eleanor, of course. Those stormy eyes finally turned to her. They held no warmth, only a distant, polite acknowledgement. It was the look one gave a piece of furniture. Eleanor would have lowered her eyes immediately. Eliza, struck by his sheer presence and her own modern instinct to meet a person's gaze, did not. She looked right back at him, her own confusion and fear momentarily forgotten in her assessment of him. He looks like he's never laughed a day in his life, she thought. His eyebrow quirked, a minute gesture of surprise. A lady's companion did not stare so boldly at a duke. Lady Eleanor, he acknowledged, his tone implying her name was an afterthought. I hear you took a fall. I trust you are recovered and will be more mindful of your footing. It wasn't a question of her well-being. It was a command to be less of an inconvenience. The arrogance of it snapped Eliza out of her trance. A flush of irritation rose on her cheeks. The old Eliza, the one who'd negotiated with difficult clients and told off catcallers on the street, surfaced before she could stop herself. The architecture is to blame, Your Grace, not my footing, she said, her tone drier than she intended. The floors are very firm. A dead silence fell over the room. The Dowager Duchess choked slightly on her tea. Sarah, who had been hovering by the door, looked utterly horrified. Leonard Bailey, the Duke of Ashworth, went perfectly still. His gaze, which had been dismissive, now focused on her with the intensity of a hawk sighting prey. He looked at her properly for the first time, his eyes narrowing slightly, taking in the unfamiliar defiance in her posture, the unapologetic directness in her brown eyes. Indeed, he said, the single word laced with frost. I shall have a word with the stone mason immediately. We cannot have the architecture, causing the staff to falter. The subtle emphasis on staff was a deliberate, cutting reminder of her place. Heat flooded Eliza's face, this time in a wave of shame and anger, at him and at herself for her stupidity. She had been here less than 2 hours and had already drawn the dangerous attention of the master of the house. She dropped her eyes to her lap, her hands clenched tightly in the lavender muslin. "My apologies, Your Grace," she murmured, forcing Eleanor's timbre back into her voice. He held his silence for a moment longer, a palpable force of displeasure before turning back to his mother. "I have matters to attend to on the estate. I will see you at dinner, mother." With a curt nod, he turned and left the room, taking the charged atmosphere with him. Eliza let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. Her heart was pounding. The Dowager Duchess was watching her, a curious, unreadable expression on her face. "Well, my dear," she said slowly, taking a slow sip of tea. "It seems that bump on the head has quite loosened your tongue." Eliza could only nod, her mind reeling. She was trapped in a past she didn't understand, in a body that wasn't hers, serving a woman who saw too much, and she had just made an enemy of the most powerful man in her orbit. The struggle had begun. Not just to survive, but to keep her own soul from being erased completely by the shadow of the quiet, forgotten Eleanor. And as she replayed the Duke's cold, handsome face in her mind, a treacherous part of her wondered if his was a shadow she even wanted to escape. Chapter 2: The Gilded Cage. The days at Ashworth Manor settled into a rhythm that was both monotonous and relentlessly demanding. For Eliza, trapped in the body of Eleanor, it was a gilded cage of exquisite torture. Every hour was a performance, every action a potential misstep. Her awakening had been a violent shove into the deep end of history, and now she was desperately trying to learn how to swim without drowning. Sarah, bless her, was an unwitting lifeline. Eliza learned to frame her endless, ignorant questions as a side effect of her memory loss, and the kindly maid was all too eager to fill in the gaps for the poor, confused dear. She learned that the Dowager Duchess, Amelia, was a widow of 10 years, sharp-witted and kind-hearted, but bored by the stifling tranquility of country life. She learned that the Duke Leonard was a man defined by duty, his life a meticulously ordered ledger of responsibilities. And she learned that Lady Eleanor Reed was the third daughter of a cash-poor earl, sent to be a companion, a role that hovered somewhere between paid help and shabby-genteel family friend, because she was too quiet to make a good match and her family needed one less mouth to feed. The irony was not lost on Eliza. She'd built a successful career on her voice, her opinions, her unique vision. Now her survival depended on her silence and her ability to fade into the wallpaper. The constraints were physical, a constant, nagging presence. The corset was her personal nemesis. On the second morning, as Sarah laced her into the contraption of whalebone and linen, pulling tighter and tighter, Eliza felt a wave of claustrophobic panic. "A little looser, please, Sarah," she gasped, bracing herself against the bedpost. Sarah paused, confused. "But my lady, it's already quite loose. Her Grace's dressmaker says a lady's figure should be a perfect column." "My column is feeling a bit fractured today," Eliza managed to say. "Please. I can't breathe." Sarah, with a doubtful frown, reluctantly loosened the laces a fraction. The relief was minimal. For the rest of the day, Eliza was acutely aware of the pressure on her ribs, the restriction of her movement. She missed denim jeans and cotton t-shirts with a visceral longing. The days were filled with activities that felt purposeless to her modern sensibilities. She spent hours in the sun-drenched drawing room with the Dowager Duchess, engaged in the mind-numbing torture of embroidery. Her first attempts were a disaster. Her hands, adept at wielding a stylus and a mouse, were all thumbs with a needle. She stabbed her fingers so many times the delicate linen was speckled with tiny drops of blood. The Dowager looked up from her own flawless work. "You seem to be struggling more than usual, my dear. That knot is ambitious." Eliza looked down at the tangled bird's nest of thread on her timbre frame that was supposed to be a flower. "I suppose my hands are still unsteady, Your Grace," she lied. Amelia said, a faint, knowing smile playing on her lips. "Perhaps we should consider a new subject. Do you play the pianoforte?" Eliza's heart sank. "I'm afraid not." The real Eleanor apparently had, and poorly. It was one less thing for her to painfully mimic. "A great pity. Reading then." "Read to me." And so Eliza read. Dry, interminable sermons and tedious poetry about shepherds and lost lambs. She read in Eleanor's soft, hesitant voice, but sometimes when a turn of phrase was particularly clumsy, she would instinctively edit it, smoothing the language, adding inflection. She couldn't help it. It was in her DNA. The dowager would often stop her needlework and simply listen, her head tilted, her expression unreadable. The meals were another exercise in silent anxiety. The number of utensils was bewildering. She watched the dowager carefully out of the corner of her eye, mimicking which fork she used for which course, terrified of causing another scene like the one with the Duke. She saw Leonard only in fleeting formal moments. He would join them for tea sometimes or pass them in the hallway. He was always impeccably polite and icily distant. He addressed his mother with a formal affection and Eliza with a deference so empty it was insulting. He never referenced their first encounter, but his coldness was a constant reminder of it. His gray eyes would sweep over her, a quick, dismissive assessment before moving on. She was a problem he had categorized and filed away. Yet, despite her best efforts to be invisible, Eleanor's strangeness began to seep out. It happened during one of their interminable strolls through the manicured gardens. The Dowager Duchess was discussing the merits of a particular rose breed, a subject that held zero interest for Eliza, whose experience with plants was limited to keeping a succulent alive on her desk. "The Rosamundi is charming, of course," the Dowager said, "but I find its fragrance lacking compared to the Gallica officinalis." Eliza, her mind wandering to the graphic design project she'd never finished, nodded absently. "It's all about the branding, really. The officinalis has a stronger market presence. Timeless. The Mundi is more of a niche product. Pretty but forgettable." There was a profound silence. Eliza blinked, pulled abruptly from her thoughts. The Dowager had stopped walking and was staring at her, a rose halfway to her nose. "I beg your pardon, my dear," Amelia said, her tone a mixture of confusion and sheer delight. "Branding? Market presence? What on earth are you talking about?" Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through Eliza. "Idiot!" she screamed at herself. "You absolute idiot!" I, she stammered, her mind racing for an explanation. "It is a term I read in a philosophical tract. From the Americas. It compared the cultivation of virtue to the cultivation of a garden. That some virtues, like some flowers, are more commercially viable than others." The lie was absurd, desperate. The Dowager's eyes sparkled with amusement. She didn't believe a word of it. Did it indeed? How fascinating. "You must find this tract for me. I should like to read it." She turned and continued walking, leaving Eliza trembling with adrenaline. "And I suppose you think my virtue is niche, Lady Eleanor?" she added over her shoulder, her voice laced with laughter. It was a disaster. And a revelation. The Dowager Duchess, it seemed, was not a woman who was easily shocked. She was intrigued. The encounter left Eliza rattled. She had to be more careful. She spent the afternoon in the library, a vast, silent room that smelled of old paper and leather. It was the one place she felt a semblance of peace. She ran her fingers along the spines of books, centuries of knowledge and stories. Here she could almost feel a connection to her old life. She was perched on a small stepladder trying to reach a volume on botany, hoping to bone up on roses to avoid future blunders, when a voice spoke from behind her, making her jump. "Looking for something, Lady Eleanor?" It was him. The Duke. She lost her balance, the world tilting. A strong hand shot out, grasping her elbow firmly, steadying her. The contact was electric. Through the sleeve of her dress, she could feel the strength and warmth of his grip. It was startlingly intimate. She scrambled down the steps, pulling her arm away as if burned. He immediately released her, his hand returning to his side, his expression shuttered. "Your Grace," she breathed, her heart hammering. I didn't hear you come in." "So I gathered." His gaze was cool, assessing. "The library is an unusual haunt for you. I was under the impression your interests lay more in assessing the structural integrity of my floors." The jab was deliberate, a reminder of her impertinence. A flush crept up her neck. The old Eliza wanted to fire back a retort, but she bit her tongue. "Be Eleanor. Be meek. I was trying to improve my mind, Your Grace," she said, looking at the floor. "To be a better companion to your mother." He was silent for a long moment. She could feel his eyes on her, and the weight of his scrutiny was unbearable. "My mother mentioned you had a unique perspective on her roses," he said finally, his tone flat. She found it amusing. Eliza's head shot up. Of course the dowager had told him. It was a game to her. She met his gaze, and for the first time she saw something other than cold disdain in his stormy eyes. It was a flicker of pure, unadulterated curiosity. He was trying to solve her like a complex equation that refused to balance. Her Grace is very kind, Eliza said carefully. She is easily entertained by novelty, he corrected, his voice hardening slightly. It is a trait that often leads to complications. The unspoken warning was clear. You are a novelty. Do not become a complication. Anger, hot and sudden, flared in her chest. Who was he to dismiss her so utterly? To reduce her to a potential inconvenience? The words were out before she could cage them. And is that how you see the world, Your Grace? As a series of potential complications to be managed? Or do you ever simply allow yourself to be entertained? The moment the words left her mouth, she regretted them. His face went utterly still, his jaw tightening. The flicker of curiosity was extinguished, replaced by a frost so deep it felt like the temperature in the room had dropped. I am a duke, Lady Eleanor, he said, his voice dangerously quiet. My duty is to my estate, my tenants and my family. My personal entertainment is not and has never been a priority. I suggest you adopt a similar focus on your own duties, which, I remind you, do not include offering your philosophical opinions on my character. He turned on his heel and walked away, his boots silent on the thick carpet. He paused at the door. And the book on botany is 2 shelves down and to the left. The latter was unnecessary. Then he was gone, leaving Eliza alone in the vast, silent library, humiliated, furious and trembling. She slid down onto the stepladder, burying her face in her hands. She had done it again. Worse than before. She had directly challenged him, questioned his very character. She had ensured that his already low opinion of her was now cemented in stone. Tears of frustration pricked her eyes. She wasn't cut out for this. The constant vigilance, the suppression of her every thought and instinct, was exhausting. She missed her freedom, her voice, her life. A life that was gone. He was here now. Eleanor. The quiet companion. She wiped her eyes angrily, taking a deep, shuddering breath. She had to try harder. She had to become Eleanor completely and utterly. She had to bury Eliza so deep she would never surface again. Getting to her feet, she went to the shelf he had indicated. He pulled out the heavy botany book. Her fingers brushed against another volume tucked beside it. It was slimmer, its leather cover worn and soft. He pulled it out. It was a book of poetry. Not the tedious kind she'd been reading to the dowager, but verses by Dawn and Marvel, full of passion and wit and intellectual fire. She opened it. On the flyleaf, in a strong, slashing script, was written, Leonard Bailey. Her breath caught. It was his. This book of passionate, complicated poetry belonged to the cold, duty-bound Duke. It was a crack in his armor. A tiny, fascinating glimpse of the man behind the title. A man who might once have been entertained by something other than ledgers and responsibilities. For a long time, Eliza stood in the silent library holding the 2 books. One on botany, one on poetry, one in each hand. They felt like the opposing weights of her new existence. The life she had to pretend to live, and the man she couldn't seem to stop thinking about. The cage, she realized, was not just made of corsets and manners. It was also made of his stormy gray eyes and the frustrating, inexplicable pull she felt towards a man who clearly wished she didn't exist at all. The struggle was no longer just for survival. It was becoming something far more dangerous. Chapter 3. A spark of something real. The days following the library incident were a study in tense avoidance. Eliza, chastened and terrified of another misstep, retreated fully into the persona of Eleanor. She spoke only when spoken to, kept her eyes downcast, and devoted herself to her embroidery with a fervor that made her fingertips ache. She became a ghost in the manor, a whisper of lavender muslin drifting from room to room. The Duke, for his part, seemed more than happy to pretend she was invisible. His greetings when they were forced upon him were curt nods. His presence at tea was a brief, formal exercise that made the air feel thin and cold. He was a fortress, and Eliza had learned the hard way that her modern instincts were useless battering rams against his walls. The Dowager Duchess watched this silent standoff with an expression of mild exasperation, as if observing two particularly stubborn chess pieces refusing to move. The tension was broken not by words, but by a child's scream. It was a bright, crisp afternoon. Eliza was walking alone along a gravel path at the edge of the manicured gardens, where the lawns gave way to the home farm. She cherished these moments of solitude, the only time she didn't feel the weight of someone's expectant gaze. The scream was sharp, piercing, and filled with pure terror. It came from the direction of the farmyard. Without thinking, Eliza hitched up her skirts and ran. The restrictive corset protested, the gravel skidded under her slippers, but adrenaline propelled her forward. This was a sound that transcended centuries, the sound of a child in pain. She burst into the farmyard to see a small crowd of servants gathered in a panicked huddle. A young stable boy, no more than 6 years old, was wailing, cradling his arm. His hand and forearm were a horrifying, bloody mess, and the metallic scent of blood filled the air. A large, skittish draft horse was being led away, its hoofs stomping nervously. The boy had gotten too close, the adults were murmuring, and the horse had trampled his hand. "Fetch the doctor from the village," the stable master was yelling, his face pale. "Quickly. He'll lose the hand by the time the doctor gets here," a woman whispered, her voice trembling. "All them bones is crushed." The boy's mother was sobbing, clutching her apron, utterly paralyzed. Eliza's modern mind snapped into focus, shoving aside the panic of Lady Eleanor. "Triage. Clean the wound. Stop the bleeding. Prevent infection. Move aside, please," she said, her voice firm and clear, cutting through the babble. It was her project manager voice, the one that got clients to stop dithering and make a decision. The servants stared at her, shocked by the authority in the tone of the quiet companion. She didn't wait for permission. She knelt in the dirt, ignoring the way the gravel bit through her thin dress. "You," she said, pointing to the stable master. "I need clean cloth. Torn sheets, anything. Boiled and dried if you have it. Now." The man, startled into obedience, turned and ran. She looked at the weeping mother. "What's his name?" "Timmy, my lady," the woman stammered. "Tommy," Eliza said, turning her full attention to the boy. Her voice softened, becoming calm and reassuring. "Tommy, look at me. I need you to be very brave for me. Can you do that?" The boy's sobs hiccuped as he met her steady gaze. She smiled at him, a genuine warm smile that Eleanor's face had probably never worn. "You're going to be all right. I'm going to help you. But I need you to be still. Very, very still. Can you show me how still you can be?" He gave a tiny, terrified nod. The stable master returned with an armful of clean, rough linen cloths. "The boiling water's on, my lady, but it'll take a moment." "This will do for now," Eliza said. "I need fresh, cool water. And brandy. Now please." She worked with an efficient grace that was utterly alien to the onlookers. She gently cleaned the worst of the dirt and blood from the wound, assessing the damage. It was bad. Lacerations, likely broken bones, but not beyond saving. She poured the brandy over the linen, ignoring the gasps at the waste of good liquor, and began to carefully wrap the hand, creating a clean, firm pressure bandage to stem the bleeding and stabilize the injury. She talked to Tommy the entire time, telling him a silly story about a clumsy duck on her father's estate, keeping his mind occupied. Her focus was absolute, her hands steady. This was something real. This was a problem she could actually solve. She was so engrossed that she didn't notice the new arrival. Leonard Bailey had been drawn by the commotion. He stood at the edge of the crowd, his expression darkening as he took in the scene. The blood, the panicked servants, and Lady Eleanor, kneeling in the dirt of his farmyard, her dress ruined, her hands covered in blood and brandy, calmly taking charge of a situation that was far beneath her station. His first emotion was a hot spike of fury. This was precisely the kind of unseemly, chaotic complication he despised. What did she think she was doing? This was a matter for a doctor, not a gently bred lady with a head full of strange fancies. He took a step forward, ready to pull her away, to reassert order, to remind her of her place in no uncertain terms. And then he stopped. He saw the way Tommy was looking at her, his tears subsiding, his trust absolute. He saw the efficiency of her movements, the clean bandage already doing its work. He heard the calm, steady tone of her voice, so different from the timid murmur or the defiant challenge he was accustomed to. This was a new voice. A capable voice. He saw the bloody, trampled hand that was now neatly bound, the crisis contained. His anger evaporated, replaced by something far more complex and unsettling. She finished tying the bandage just as the harried village doctor arrived, bag in hand. Eliza looked up, her face smudged with dirt, a stray strand of hair escaping her cap. She smiled with relief at the doctor. "The bleeding is stopped," she said, her voice losing its professional edge and becoming Eleanor's again, though laced with fatigue. "I've stabilized it as best I could. There appear to be multiple fractures. The brandy was for cleaning," she added, seeing the doctor's look of surprise at the smell. The doctor, an older man, blinked at her, then knelt to examine her work. He nodded slowly, a look of grudging respect on his face. Good job, miss. Very good. That'll give me a fighting chance to save it." He set to work and the crowd began to disperse, the immediate panic over. It was only then that Eliza noticed the Duke. He was standing a few feet away watching her. The cold disdain was gone. The icy curiosity from the library was back, but it was warmer now, tinged with something she couldn't name, awe perhaps, or sheer unvarnished confusion. Her heart stuttered. How much had he seen? What would he say? She braced for the reprimand, for the cold lecture on propriety. He said nothing. He just looked at her, his gray eyes tracing the line of her dirty cheek, her bloody hands, her ruined dress. The silence stretched, thick and heavy with unspoken questions. Finally he turned to the stable master. "See that the boy and his family want for nothing. Inform me of the doctor's prognosis." His voice was even, controlled, the Duke's voice. Then he turned back to Eliza. He didn't offer her his hand. He simply said, "My study. Now." It was not a request. Eliza's stomach clenched. She got to her feet, her legs trembling now that the adrenaline had faded. She followed his rigid back across the yard, through a side entrance, and into the stark, orderly silence of his private domain. The study was a reflection of the man, large, powerful, and impeccably ordered. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a massive mahogany desk devoid of clutter, heavy leather chairs. A portrait of a stern-looking man, his father, she presumed, glowered down from above the fireplace. It smelled of leather, ink, and him, a faint, clean scent of sandalwood and crisp air. He closed the door behind them, and the click of the latch sounded unnaturally loud in the quiet room. He did not sit behind his desk, a barrier between them. Instead he stood before the cold fireplace, facing her. The proximity was unnerving. "Explain yourself," he said. His voice was low, but the command in it was absolute. Eliza looked down at her hands, stained with Tommy's blood. She wiped them uselessly on her already ruined skirt. The boy was hurt. They were panicking. "I knew what to do." "How?" The word was sharp, a pistol crack. "How could you possibly know what to do? Ladies of your station do not treat trampled hands. They faint at the sight of blood. They do not command my servants. They do not kneel in the dirt." He was circling her now, a predator trying to understand a new, baffling creature in his territory. I read about it," she said, falling back on the weakest of excuses, her eyes fixed on the Persian rug. "Do not lie to me." He stopped in front of her. He didn't touch her, but his presence was overwhelming. "You did not read about that in a book of philosophy or poetry. What you did out there was not theoretical. It was practiced. Expert even. The doctor saw it. I saw it." He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Who are you?" The question hung in the air between them, terrifying and direct. He saw it. He saw the crack in her facade, and he was determined to pry it open. Tears of frustration and fear welled in her eyes. He was so tired of lying. The words tumbled out, a half-truth forged in exhaustion. "The fever. The one I had before I came here. It changed me. It was like I woke up and the world was different. Sharper. And things I never knew. I just knew." She dared to look up at him, pleading in her eyes. "I cannot explain it, Your Grace. I only know that I saw a child in pain and I acted. I would do it again. If you mean to dismiss me for it, then so be it." She expected anger. She expected him to call her hysterical, to finally banish her from his sight. Instead he just stared at her, his expression unreadable. He was searching her face, looking for the lie, the trick. He saw the dirt, the tears, the genuine distress. He saw the bloody evidence of her compassion. The rigid line of his shoulders softened, almost imperceptibly. The storm in his eyes calmed to a gray, contemplative stillness. "A fever," he repeated, his tone flat. He didn't believe her. But he also couldn't explain what he had witnessed. The contradiction, the timid companion and the capable woman, refused to resolve itself in his orderly mind. "You will not be dismissed," he said finally, turning away from her to look out the window. "What you did was unseemly. A breach of conduct that I cannot and will not condone." Eliza's heart sank. He turned back and his gaze was different. The ice had melted, leaving something more perplexing in its wake. But it was also effective. "The boy may keep his hand because of you." He seemed to struggle with the next words as if they were in a foreign language. "For that, you have my thanks." Thanks. The word was so unexpected, so utterly alien coming from him, that Eliza could only stare. He cleared his throat, uncomfortable with the exchange. The moment of raw honesty was over. The Duke was reasserting himself. "You will go and change. Your dress is ruined. And we will not speak of this unorthodox behavior again. Is that understood?" It was a command, but it was also a truce. A bizarre, fragile, and utterly unexpected truce. "Yes, Your Grace," Eliza whispered. "You are dismissed." She fled from the study, her mind reeling. She had expected a battle and had instead been granted a pardon she didn't understand. She had seen a crack in his armor, and he had seen a glimpse of the real her. Not the defiant modern woman, but the competent, compassionate one. As the door closed behind her, Leonard Bailey remained at the window, watching her figure hurry across the lawn toward the manor. The image of her, kneeling in the dirt, calm and capable, was burned into his mind. It was at odds with everything he knew. It was disruptive. It was illogical. He was forced to admit, the most compelling thing he had witnessed in years. The walls of his perfectly ordered world had not been breached by force, but by a single inexplicable act of kindness. And for the first time he wasn't sure he wanted to repair them. Of course. Here is Chapter 4 of The Duke's Anachronistic Heart. Chapter 4. The Art of Conversation. The fragile truce between Eliza and the Duke settled over Ashworth Manor like a thin layer of frost, precarious, beautiful, and cold. There was no repetition of his thanks, no acknowledgement of the farmyard incident. Life returned to its prescribed rhythm. Embroidery, reading, solitary walks, and tense, silent meals where the only sound was the delicate clink of silver on porcelain. Yet something had fundamentally shifted. The air was different. When Leonard's gaze now passed over her, it was not merely dismissive. It was assessing, thoughtful. He was watching her, a naturalist observing a strange new species, trying to categorize a creature that continually defied classification. Eliza, for her part, felt his scrutiny like a physical touch. It made the back of her neck prickle. She redoubled her efforts to be the perfect, invisible Eleanor, speaking only when necessary and in the softest of murmurs. But the memory of his gratitude, however stiffly delivered, was a tiny, warm ember in the cold fortress of her fear. He had seen her capability and had not entirely condemned it. The catalyst for change, as always, was the Dowager Duchess. One evening, as a footman laid the table for dinner for two, Amelia waved a dismissive hand. No, set a third place, please. Lady Eleanor will be joining us tonight." Eliza, who had been hovering near the door ready to make her escape to a solitary meal in her room, froze. "Your Grace, that is not necessary. Nonsense, my dear," Amelia interrupted, her eyes sparkling. "You must be starved for decent conversation. Listening to me prattle on about roses all day can only sustain one for so long. Besides," she added with a mischievous glint, "my son's company is so bracing. It will do you good." Eliza's stomach twisted into a knot of dread. A whole meal? Under his direct, unblinking observation? It was a recipe for disaster. Leonard entered then, pausing on the threshold as he took in the third place setting. His eyes flicked from the table to his mother's innocent expression, then to Eliza's pale face. A muscle ticked in his jaw, but he merely gave a curt nod. "Mother." "Lady Eleanor." The meal began in agonizing silence. Courses were served and removed with quiet efficiency. Eliza kept her eyes glued to her plate, eating with meticulous care, every bite tasting like ash. The Dowager Duchess seemed content to let the silence stretch. a small, knowing smile playing on her lips as she glanced between her stony-faced son and the terrified companion. It was Leonard who finally broke the quiet, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "I trust you have recovered from your exertions the other day, Lady Eleanor." It was not quite a question, not quite an accusation. Eliza's head shot up. She met his gaze for a fleeting second before looking down again. "Yes, Your Grace. Thank you." "It was quite the spectacle," the dowager said cheerfully, taking a sip of wine. "The entire household is talking about it. Our quiet little Eleanor, a heroine of the farmyard. You are a constant source of surprise, my dear." Eliza wished the floor would open up and swallow her. "It was a breach of propriety," Leonard stated, his tone cool. "One that I hope will not be repeated." He was re-establishing the boundary, reminding everyone at the table of their places. The words sparked a familiar flare of irritation in Eliza's chest. She clutched her napkin in her lap. "He thanked me for it," she wanted to shout. But she held her tongue. The dowager, however, would not let it go. "Oh, pish-posh, Leonard. Propriety be damned. The child's hand was saved. Surely even you must see the value in that over a dusty old rule." Leonard's eyes narrowed. "Rules and propriety are the foundations of order, mother. Without them there is chaos. And without compassion, there is only a very orderly sort of hell," the dowager retorted smoothly. Eliza held her breath. She was a spectator at a verbal duel she had no wish to join. Leonard placed his fork down with precise calm. "Compassion has its place. But it must be exercised within the appropriate structure. A duke cannot run his estate on compassion alone." The words were like a gauntlet thrown down. Not at his mother, Eliza realized with a start, but at her. He was challenging the very philosophy that had driven her actions. And without thinking, without planning, the old Eliza, the one who loved a good debate, caught the gauntlet. "Can it not, Your Grace?" The words were out, soft but clear. Both Baileys turned to look at her, identical expressions of surprise on their faces. She felt a wave of dizzying panic, but it was too late to retreat. She kept her eyes on her plate, her voice hesitant, choosing her words with the care of someone crossing a frozen river. "I mean no disrespect, but is not the well-being of the people on the estate the ultimate measure of its order? If a rule prevents a good outcome, is the rule not then the source of disorder?" There was a dead silence. Leonard was staring at her, his stormy eyes wide. The dowager looked utterly delighted. "An interesting point, Lady Eleanor," Leonard said, his voice dangerously quiet. "And how precisely does one define a good outcome? By whose measure? Yours? What you perceive as good, another may perceive as reckless." The direct engagement was terrifying and thrilling. Her heart hammered against her ribs. "By the measure of the saved hand, Your Grace," she said, daring another glance at him. "The outcome seems rather objectively good." A faint, almost imperceptible flush touched his cheekbones. He was not used to being contradicted, least of all by a woman of her station. A single instance does not disprove a universal principle. For every saved hand, a breach of protocol could lead to a dozen other complications. A loss of respect for authority, a blurring of necessary boundaries. But if the authority uses its power to save hands, would it not gain more respect, not less? She countered, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. Would the boundaries not become more meaningful because they are built on mutual benefit rather than fear? She had almost said tyranny. The Dowager Duchess actually giggled, quickly disguising it as a cough. Leonard leaned back in his chair, regarding her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. He was no longer angry. He was fascinated. The baffling creature was not just acting strangely, it was reasoning. Poorly in his opinion, but reasoning nonetheless. "You speak of ideals, Lady Eleanor," he said, and his tone had changed. It was less confrontational, more pedagogical. "The world is not built on ideals. It is built on systems. Systems of power, of economics, of social hierarchy. These systems, while imperfect, provide stability. Your fever-induced philosophy, while novel, ignores the practical realities of governance." He was trying to box her in with logic, to defeat her with the weight of his worldview. The old Eliza, the designer who fought for her creative vision against pragmatic clients, recognized the tactic. "And do systems not exist to serve people, Your Grace?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Or do people exist to serve the systems?" If a system fails a child's hand, is it not the system that is flawed? It was a radically modern thought, a concept of individualism that would have been heresy to a man whose identity was the system itself. Leonard opened his mouth to retort, then closed it. He looked utterly nonplussed. He picked up his wine glass, studying the deep red liquid as if the answer lay within it. The dowager watched the exchange, her eyes dancing between them. The conversation shifted then, pulled away from the precipice by the dowager, who cleverly introduced the topic of a new play being performed in London. But the tone was set. The boundary had been crossed. For the rest of the meal, Leonard would occasionally pose a question to Eliza, pulling her into the conversation not as an ornament, but as a participant. He asked her opinion on a bill going through Parliament regarding agricultural reforms, his tone challenging, expecting her to have none. Eliza, drawing on half-remembered history lessons and her own understanding of economics, gave a cautious, carefully worded reply about the potential benefits and pitfalls for tenant farmers. It was simplistic, but it was informed by a perspective he had never considered. He didn't agree with her. He argued his point, his logic relentless. But he listened. He truly listened, his gray eyes fixed on her, analyzing her every word. And Eliza, despite her fear, found herself rising to the challenge. She parried his points, used his own logic against him, and when she was out of her depth she asked questions. Intelligent, probing questions that forced him to explain and defend his positions in ways he never had to before. It was mentally exhausting and utterly exhilarating. For the first time since her transmigration she was using her mind, not just mimicking manners. She was seen not as Eleanor and not just as a disruption but as an intellect. A flawed one in his eyes but a functioning one. By the time the dessert course was cleared, Eliza was flushed, her mind buzzing. She felt more alive than she had in weeks. Leonard wiped his mouth with his napkin and stood. "Mother. Lady Eleanor." His tone was formal, but his eyes, as they rested on Eliza, held a new, unsettling warmth. "Thank you for a stimulating evening." He left the room and the air seemed to sigh in relief. The Dowager Duchess turned to Eliza, a wide, triumphant smile on her face. "Well, my dear, I do believe that is the first time I have seen my son lost for words on the topic of governance. Stimulating evening, indeed. From him that is high praise indeed." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I told you his company was bracing." Eliza managed a weak smile, her hands trembling as she laid her napkin on the table. She felt as if she had just run a marathon. Later, in the silence of her bedchamber, she replayed the entire conversation in her head. The intensity of his gaze, the deep rumble of his voice as he debated her, the way his mind worked. Sharp, analytical and rigid but capable of engagement. He had been infuriating, arrogant, condescending, and she had never found anyone more attractive in her life. The realization was a bolt of lightning. It wasn't just his physical beauty, though that was undeniable. It was the sheer power of his intellect, the force of his presence, the challenge he represented. He was the ultimate test of her wits, the immovable object to her irrepressible force. And for a few moments tonight she had moved him. She had made him think. A dangerous, thrilling hope began to uncurl within her. Perhaps she didn't have to disappear entirely. Perhaps in this strange, confined world, there was a place for a sliver of Eliza, not the graphic designer from the future, but the woman who was unafraid to speak her mind, to care deeply, to challenge a duke over dinner. She had gone into the meal fearing exposure. She left it feeling something she hadn't felt since she woke up in this body, a sense of possibility. Across the manor in his study, Leonard Bailey poured a brandy he didn't really want. He stood before the fire, staring into the flames, his mind replaying the same conversation. "Do systems not exist to serve people, Your Grace?" Her words echoed in his head, unsettlingly persistent. They were naive. They were radical. They were, he tried to tell himself, the misguided ramblings of a woman whose illness had addled her brain. But they were also, he was forced to admit, compelling. They hinted at a worldview that was entirely foreign to him, one that was messy, emotional and infuriatingly focused on the individual rather than the whole. He saw her face in his mind's eye, flushed with the heat of debate, her brown eyes alight with an intelligence and passion that the timid Eleanor had never possessed. He had found himself wanting to argue with her just to keep that light in her eyes, to keep her engaged with him. It was a profoundly disquieting thought. He had always valued conversation for its clarity and purpose. Tonight's conversation had been messy, illogical, and frustrating. And it had been the most engaging dialogue he'd had in years. He downed the brandy in one swallow, the burn doing little to clear his head. The quiet, overlooked companion had become a complication far more dangerous than he could have ever imagined. She wasn't just disrupting his household. She was disrupting his mind. Chapter 5. The Stroll in the Storm. A new, fragile routine established itself in the days that followed the dinner debate. The air between Eliza and the Duke thrummed with a silent, unacknowledged tension. Conversations, when they occurred, were no longer mere exchanges of platitudes. They were skirmishes. He would make a declarative statement about estate management or the classics, and she, emboldened by her small victory, would offer a cautious counterpoint. He would rebut, his logic a swift, elegant blade, and she would parry, her arguments less refined but rooted in a perspective he found endlessly puzzling. The Dowager Duchess watched it all like a spectator at a particularly entertaining tennis match, her needle often still in her lap as she followed the verbal volleys. It was she who proposed the outing. "This fine weather is a gift not to be squandered indoors," she declared one morning, looking out at the sun-drenched lawns. "We shall take a walk. All of us." Her gaze swept meaningfully over her son, who was attempting to bury himself behind the financial pages. "The fresh air will do you good, Leonard. You are beginning to resemble one of your account books. All columns and no prose." Leonard lowered the paper, a frown etched on his face. "Mother, I have a great deal of work." "Nonsense. Can wait. Lady Eleanor, you will join us, of course." Eliza, who had been trying to make her stitches resemble anything close to a flower, looked up. "A walk. With him. For pleasure." The concept was terrifying. "Of course, Your Grace." And so an hour later the three of them set out. The Dowager, arm in arm with a footman, led the way at a surprisingly sprightly pace. Eliza and the Duke followed a few paces behind, a silence stretching between them that was thick with everything unsaid. The grounds of Ashworth Manor were breathtaking. They walked away from the formal gardens, following a path that wound through a grove of ancient oaks and down toward a babbling stream. The air was sweet with the scent of damp earth and blooming wildflowers. For a moment, Eliza could almost forget the corset and the constant performance. The beauty was timeless. "My mother is determined to improve my constitution," Leonard said suddenly, his voice cutting through the quiet. It was the first time he had initiated conversation. Eliza glanced at him. He was not looking at her, his profile stern against the dappled sunlight. "She is a force of nature, Your Grace." A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. "That is one way to put it." They walked on. The sound of the stream grew louder. "And you?" he asked after another moment. "Do you find the country air improving?" It was a simple question, but from him it felt weighted. He was asking her something more. "Are you happy here? Are you settling into your role? Are you becoming less of a complication?" "It is certainly different from what I am used to," Eliza said carefully, choosing her words. "The air in London is thicker. With smoke and people. It feels clearer. Though sometimes the clarity can be," she searched for the right word, "unsettling." He did look at her then, his gray eyes sharp. "How so?" "In the city one can get lost in the crowd. One can be anonymous. Here," she gestured to the vast empty landscape around them, "everything feels more exposed. There is nowhere to hide." She wasn't just talking about the scenery. He considered this, his gaze sweeping over the rolling hills that were his domain. "I have never found anonymity to be a desirable state. A man, or a woman, is defined by their place in the world. To be anonymous is to be nothing. Or to be free," Eliza countered softly. "To be defined by one's own actions, not one's title or family name." He stopped walking, turning fully to face her. The footman and the Dowager were drawing ahead, giving them a semblance of privacy. "You speak of freedom as if it were a simple thing. State of being. It is not. It is a product of order and security. The freedom you seem to crave is the freedom of chaos. The freedom to choose," she insisted, her heart beginning to pound. This was at the core of their conflict. The freedom to make one's own mistakes, to help a child in the dirt if one chooses, to To love who one wants, she almost said, but caught herself. His expression was intense, perplexed. And you believe you had more of this freedom before? Eliza's blood ran cold. Before the fever. He had to remember the lie. I believe I had different boundaries, Your Grace. Before he could respond, a large, cold drop of water landed on Eliza's nose. Then another on her cheek. She looked up. The brilliant blue sky had been swiftly consumed by rolling gray clouds. The breeze, once gentle, now had a sharp, wet edge. Oh dear, the dowager called out, hurrying back toward them. It seems we are in for a soaking. Leonard, the summer house is too far. What is closer? Leonard's head snapped up, assessing their position with a practiced eye. The old gardener's shed. Just through those trees. This way. Quickly. The heavens opened. It was not a gentle rain but a sudden, drenching downpour. The dowager shrieked with laughter as the footman hurried her along. Leonard, without a second thought, grabbed Eliza's hand. His grip was firm, warm, and startling. It was the first time he had touched her since steadying her in the library. A jolt, hot and electric, shot up her arm. He pulled her along, breaking into a run, leading her off the path and through a thicket of trees. There it was, a small stone shed with a slate roof, nearly hidden by ivy. The footman got the door open and they all tumbled inside, breathless and laughing, except for Leonard, who was merely breathing heavily, his expression one of mild annoyance at the weather's inconvenience. The shed was a single room, crowded with forgotten tools, burlap sacks of bulbs, and the rich, loamy smell of earth. It was dry but dim, the only light coming from a single dusty window. The sound of the rain on the slate roof was a deafening drumming, enclosing them in a world of their own. Well, the dowager exclaimed, wringing water from her skirts. What an adventure. James, she said to the footman, you are drenched. Run back to the house and fetch umbrellas and a dry cloak for me. We shall wait here. The footman, James, looked hesitant. Your Grace, I shouldn't leave you. Nonsense, we have the Duke to protect us from any marauding hedgehogs. Go on. With a nervous bow, James ducked back out into the deluge and was gone. The three of them stood in the cramped space. The dowager found an upturned crate and sat down, humming to herself as if she did this every day. Leonard stood rigidly by the door, his arms crossed, watching the rain sheet down outside. Eliza stood near a workbench, her arms wrapped around herself. Her dress was soaked through, clinging to her skin, and she was starting to shiver. The silence stretched, filled only by the roar of the storm. The space was too small. Leonard seemed to fill half of it with his presence alone. Eliza was acutely aware of every breath he took, every shift of his weight. You are cold, he stated, his voice abrupt in the quiet. It is nothing, Your Grace, she murmured through slightly chattering teeth. He frowned, then shrugged out of his own coat. It was a simple, practical gesture, but it felt immensely intimate. He stepped toward her and draped the heavy, sodden wool over her shoulders. It was still warm from his body and carried his scent, sandalwood, rain, and him. The weight of it was overwhelming. Eliza's breath hitched. Thank you, she whispered, pulling it tighter around her. His residual warmth seeped into her chilled skin. He didn't step back. They were standing very close in the dim, dusty light. The dowager, tactfully, seemed engrossed in studying a spiderweb in the corner. This is ridiculous, Leonard muttered, though it was unclear if he meant the weather, their situation, or the fact that he had just given her his coat. It's just water, Eliza found herself saying, echoing a modern sentiment. It'll dry. He looked down at her, water droplets still clinging to his dark hair. Just water, he repeated, a strange note in his voice. You have a singular talent for reducing complex situations to their most basic components. Is that a criticism, Your Grace? It is an observation. His gray eyes were dark in the gloom, searching her face. You were speaking of freedom. Before the rain. The conversation, so violently interrupted, now felt dangerous and urgent in this confined space. The drumming rain isolated them, pressed them together. Eliza said, her voice barely audible over the downpour. And do you feel you lack it here? He asked. The question was blunt, but his tone was not accusatory. Curious. Are you a prisoner at Ashworth, Lady Eleanor? The use of her name, her stolen name, sent a pang of guilt through her. She looked away out the window at the blurry, gray world. Not a prisoner. But a companion's life is one of observation, not participation. And you wish to participate? He took a half step closer. She could feel the heat radiating from him. In what way? In life. In this world. With you. The thoughts were screaming in her head. She dared to look up at him. The usual coldness in his eyes was gone, replaced by a deep, unsettling intensity. The shed, the storm, his coat around her shoulders. It was stripping away all pretense. I think everyone wishes to feel that their existence matters, she said, her voice trembling. That they have some agency in their own story. Even if that story is small. Your story is not small, he said, and the roughness in his voice made her heart stutter. It is the most confounding story I have ever encountered. The admission hung between them, raw and honest. He was not the Duke in this moment. He was Leonard, a man utterly bewildered by her. I do not mean to be a source of confusion, she said, her eyes locked with his. I know, he replied softly. That is what makes it all the more. He trailed off, his gaze dropping to her lips. The world narrowed to the space between them. The drumming rain, the smell of wet earth and his scent on the coat, the way he was looking at her. It was too much. Eliza's breath caught. She saw the conflict in his eyes, the war between his rigid control and the undeniable pull he felt. His hand came up, slowly as if moving through water. He didn't touch her. His fingers hovered mere inches from her cheek, tracing the air beside her face. She could feel the heat of his hand, the potential of that touch. It was the most intimate non-touch of her life. Her own hand lifted, an involuntary response, a mirror of his movement. Her fingertips almost brushed the damp fabric of his waistcoat. A sudden louder crack of thunder shook the little shed. Leonard jerked back as if burned, his hand dropping to his side. The shutters came down over his expression, the Duke slamming back into place. The rain is letting up, he said, his voice cold and formal again, devoid of the warmth of a moment before. He turned to look out the window, putting his back to her. The spell was broken. The moment was lost. Eliza wrapped his coat tighter around her, the warmth now feeling like a betrayal. The distance he had put between them was a physical ache. He had seen it. For a heartbeat she had seen the man behind the title, a man as captivated and confused by her as she was by him. And she had felt his terrifying, exhilarating want. And then he had locked it away. The Dowager Duchess, who had witnessed the entire silent exchange, gave a small, quiet sigh. She looked from her son's rigid back to Eliza's devastated face. Yes, the Dowager said softly, her voice full of a strange sadness. I believe it is. Chapter 6. The Mask Slips. The Dowager Duchess's decision to host a small dinner party was, in Eliza's opinion, a form of exquisite social torture. It was not a grand ball, but a gathering of a dozen or so local gentry, neighboring landowners, a retired naval captain and his wife, the rector. It was precisely the kind of intimate conversational affair where a lady's companion, every misstep would be magnified. The memory of the shed, of Leonard's almost touch, was a ghost that haunted her. In the days since he had been more remote than ever, his formality a fortress wall rebuilt twice as high. The vulnerability she had glimpsed was gone, buried under a layer of ice so thick it seemed impenetrable. His retreat was a rejection, and it stung more deeply than his initial disdain. You must wear the cream silk tonight, my lady, Sarah said, laying the dress out on the bed. It was Eleanor's best gown, simple but elegantly cut. With the pearl cross. It belonged to your grandmother, did it not? Eliza looked at the delicate necklace. Another piece of a life that wasn't hers. Yes, she lied, her throat tight. It's lovely. An hour later, standing at the top of the grand staircase, she felt anything but lovely. She felt like a fraud about to be exposed on a very small, very well-lit stage. The murmur of conversation and the soft strains of a quartet floated up from the drawing room below. Her palms were damp inside her gloves. She took a deep breath, channeling the old Eliza who had pitched designs to intimidating corporate clients. You can do this. Just smile and nod. Be Eleanor. For the first hour she almost managed it. She stayed close to the Dowager's side, a silent, smiling shadow. She accepted a glass of ratafia she didn't want and nibbled on a canopy she couldn't taste. She curtsied and murmured, "How do you do?" until the phrases lost all meaning. The problems began when people tried to engage her in conversation. "And do you enjoy the country, Lady Eleanor?" asked Mrs. Bird, the rector's wife, a woman with a face like a kindly hawk. "Oh yes," Eliza said, employing Eleanor's soft tone. "It's very green." "Green," Mrs. Bird repeated, her smile faltering slightly. "The trees. And the grass. So much of it," Eliza elaborated, realizing too late how inane she sounded. "Indeed," Mrs. Bird said, and moved swiftly on to someone less botanically obsessed. Next was the retired naval captain, a boisterous man with a loud laugh. "So you're Chisholm's girl. Quiet little thing, aren't you? Not like your sister. Now there's a lively one. Danced with her at Almack's once. Nearly wore out my shoes." Eliza forced a smile. "Yes, Cynthia is very lively. And what of you? Do you dance, girl?" The question was innocent, but it threw her. Her mind went blank on the names of Regency dances. I'm fond of the shuffle," she said, cringing internally even as the words left her mouth. The captain stared at her for a beat before roaring with laughter. "The shuffle? By Jove, that's a new one. I shall have to suggest it to the patronesses." He clapped her on the arm a little too hard and wandered off, still chuckling. Eliza's cheeks were burning. She could feel a headache beginning to pound behind her eyes. This was a disaster. She needed air. She was making her way toward the terrace doors when a large, florid-faced man stepped into her path. Sir Reginald Moore, a landowner known for his conservative views and his portly stature. "Ah, the mysterious Lady Eleanor," he boomed, his breath smelling faintly of claret. "Amelia's little shadow. Tell me, my dear, what do you make of this dreadful nonsense about reforming the poor laws? Giving them ideas above their station, I say. A full belly and a roof should be thanks enough, what?" It was a rhetorical question, the kind a man like him asked a woman like her, expecting murmured agreement. But the comment grated on her modern sensibilities. The words were out before she could stop them. "I suppose it depends on whether one views a full belly as a privilege to be granted, or a right to be expected," she said, her voice quiet but clear. Sir Reginald's jowly face froze in astonishment. The small circle of people around them fell silent. Eliza's heart plummeted to her toes. "Oh God. What have I done?" Oh, right." Sir Reginald spluttered, his face turning an alarming shade of purple. "My dear girl, what a radical, nay, a Jacobin thing to say. Who has been filling your head with such?" "I believe Lady Eleanor was paraphrasing the works of John Locke, Sir Reginald," a cool, familiar voice cut in. Leonard was suddenly there at her elbow, his presence a solid, intimidating wall. "A rather complex philosophical point for a dinner party, don't you think? I find the conversation flows more easily on topics less likely to cause apoplexy. The weather, for instance. It is unseasonably warm, is it not?" His tone was light, almost conversational, but his eyes were chips of flint. The message was unmistakable. Sir Reginald, deflated and scowling, muttered something about the weather and turned away. The others in the circle quickly found somewhere else to be. Leonard did not look at her. He offered his arm, his posture rigid. "A moment, Lady Eleanor," he said, his voice low and devoid of emotion. He led her not to the terrace, but to a relatively quiet alcove near the pianoforte. He dropped her arm as if it were hot coal. "What?" he said through gritted teeth, his voice a low, furious whisper. "Do you think you are doing?" He was," she stammered, humiliation washing over her. "I do not care what he was," Leonard interrupted, his gray eyes blazing with a cold fire. "You are a guest under my roof. Your conduct reflects on this house. You do not engage in political debate. You certainly do not express seditious views to a man who could ruin your reputation with a word." "Seditious? I only said—" "I know what you said," he hissed, leaning closer. The scent of him, sandalwood and anger, surrounded her. "You spoke of rights for the poor in the drawing-room of a duke. Are you determined to make yourself an outcast? To confirm every suspicion I have had about you since you arrived?" His words were meant to wound, and they did. They sliced through her, confirming her deepest fear, that he saw her only as a problem, an embarrassment. The stress of the evening, the weight of her secret, the memory of his rejection in the shed, it all crashed down on her. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and mortifying. She blinked them back furiously. "My apologies, Your Grace," she whispered, her voice thick. "I shall strive to be more decorative in the future." A silent, pretty ornament for your wall. Would that suit you better? She saw a flash of something, shock perhaps, in his eyes before the anger returned. Do not be flippant with me. Why not? The dam broke. The tears she'd been holding back spilled over. You have made your opinion of me perfectly clear. I am a complication. A disruption. A novelty to be dismissed when the entertainment is over. She was paraphrasing his own words back to him, her voice trembling with a pain she could no longer conceal. You think me a foolish, radical woman with a head addled by fever. You're probably right. But at least my foolishness comes from a place of caring about something other than order. She turned away from him, unable to bear his cold, handsome face a moment longer. She stared blindly at the pianoforte, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. She had ruined everything. The mask of Eleanor had not just slipped, it had shattered at his feet. She expected him to walk away, to leave her there in her humiliation. He didn't. She felt him move closer. He didn't touch her. The silence between them was broken only by the distant chatter of the party and the ragged sound of her breathing. You are crying, he said. His voice was different. The anger was gone, replaced by a strange, bewildered hoarseness. It is of no consequence, she choked out, wiping furiously at her cheeks with her gloved hands. Another breach of decorum. Add it to my list of sins. Stop it. The command was soft but undeniable. She felt his hand then, not on her arm but on her shoulder. His touch was hesitant, almost tentative, as if he were handling something fragile and wild. The heat of it seared through the silk of her gown. She froze, every nerve ending, acutely aware of that single point of contact. Look at me, he said, his voice low. Slowly, trembling, she turned to face him. Her face was streaked with tears, her eyes undoubtedly red and puffy. He was a mess. She felt utterly exposed. He was looking down at her, his stormy eyes dark with an emotion she couldn't name. His gaze traced the tracks of her tears, the vulnerability she could no longer hide. The cold Duke was gone. In his place was the man from the shed, the one who was captivated and confused. You are the most baffling creature, he whispered, his thumb moving almost imperceptibly on her shoulder, a tiny soothing stroke. You speak of rights for the poor with the conviction of a revolutionary, and you cry over a harsh word like a child. You are either the greatest actress I have ever encountered or what, she breathed, her heart hammering against her ribs. Or I do not know you at all, he finished, his voice raw. The woman I see, she does not match the woman I was told to expect. She is a living contradiction. He was seeing her. Not Eleanor. Her. The real her bleeding through the cracks. Perhaps the woman you were told to expect never existed, she said, her voice barely a whisper. His gaze dropped to her lips again, and this time he did not look away. The air between them crackled with the same tension that had filled the shed. The music, the party, the world, it all faded into a distant hum. Leonard. The dowager's voice, laced with concern, cut through the moment like a knife. Is everything quite all right? Lady Eleanor, my dear, you look pale. They sprang apart as if scalded. The Duke's hand fell from her shoulder, and the shutters slammed down over his expression once more, though a muscle was twitching furiously in his jaw. Lady Eleanor is feeling unwell, he said, his voice returning to its usual, clipped formality, though it sounded strained. The heat of the room. I was suggesting she take some air. An excellent idea, the dowager said, her sharp eyes missing nothing. She linked her arm through Eliza's. Come, my dear. Let us find you a quiet spot on the terrace. As the dowager led her away, Eliza glanced back over her shoulder. Leonard was still standing in the alcove, alone, one hand clenched into a white-knuckled fist at his side. He was staring after her, his gray eyes full of a storm more turbulent than any she had ever seen. He had called her a beautiful mystery. And in that moment she knew the mystery was no longer just a source of irritation for him. It had become an obsession. And she, heartbroken, terrified, and more alive than she had ever felt, was utterly obsessed in return. The struggle was no longer about hiding. It was about the terrifying, exhilarating possibility of being found out. Chapter 7. The Trust. The morning after the dinner party dawned bright and clear, a cruel contrast to the storm of emotion raging within Eliza. She felt raw, flayed open. The memory of her public tears, of Sir Reginald's purple-faced outrage, and most of all, of Leonard's hand on her shoulder and the tortured look in his eyes, played on a relentless loop in her mind. She half expected a summons. A note delivered by a stern-faced butler, informing her that the Duke required her presence in his study for her dismissal. The hours ticked by in an agony of anticipation. She couldn't focus on her embroidery. The novel the Dowager had given her was a blur of meaningless words. The Dowager herself had been uncharacteristically quiet, watching Eliza with a mixture of sympathy and keen interest. She had not pressed for details about the alcove, for which Eliza was profoundly grateful. It was not a summons that came, but an invitation. Sarah brought it to her in the late afternoon. "His Grace asks if you would walk with him in the East Garden, my lady," Sarah said, her eyes wide with curiosity. "At your convenience, of course." Eliza's heart gave a frantic lurch. "At your convenience." It was a phrase of deference, of choice. It was not a command. That more than anything set her nerves alight. She dressed with trembling hands, choosing a simple walking dress of dove gray. She felt like a prisoner walking to her own trial. What would he say? Would it be the cold, furious Duke from the alcove, or the bewildered man who had almost comforted her? He was waiting for her by a stone bench overlooking a manicured knot garden. He stood stiffly, his hands clasped behind his back, watching the bees drone over the lavender. He turned as she approached and her breath caught. He looked tired. The usual aura of impenetrable control was muted, the lines around his eyes more pronounced. "Lady Eleanor," he said, his voice neutral. He did not smile, but his gaze was not hostile. "Your Grace." She dipped into a curtsy, her eyes fixed on the gravel path. A pause stretched between them, thick and awkward. "I wish to," he began, then stopped, clearing his throat. He seemed to be searching for words, a novel experience for a man who always spoke with such definitive certainty. The events of last evening were regrettable. Eliza's heart sank. This was it. The polite prelude to her dismissal. "I apologize for my conduct, Your Grace." It was unforgivable. "No," he said, the word sharp. He took a half-step toward her. "That is not. I am not here to extract another apology from you." He looked away frustrated. "Sir Reginald is a pompous fool. Your sentiment, while imprudently expressed, was not without a certain moral logic." Eliza could only stare. Was the Duke of Ashworth, the bastion of tradition and order, actually admitting she might have had a point? He saw her astonishment and his jaw tightened. "Do not look so surprised. I am capable of recognizing a valid argument, even when it is delivered in an inappropriate setting." "I see," Eliza said, though she didn't, not really. They began to walk, falling into step beside each other. The silence was less tense now, filled with the sounds of the garden, the crunch of gravel, the chirping of sparrows, the distant hum of activity from the home farm. "I owe you an apology," he said suddenly, the words seeming to be wrenched from him. Eliza stumbled on a loose stone. He caught her elbow instinctively, steadying her. The contact was brief, but it sent a jolt through them both. He released her immediately. "For what?" she asked, her voice unsteady. "For my words in the alcove. They were unduly harsh." He kept his eyes fixed straight ahead. "I accused you of seeking to cause disruption. I do not believe that is your intention." It was the closest he would likely ever come to saying I was wrong. Eliza felt something tight and anxious in her chest begin to loosen. "Then what do you believe my intention is, Your Grace?" she dared to ask. He was quiet for a long time, considering the question as if it were a complex legal brief. "I believe," he said slowly, "you act from a place of deeply felt conviction. A conviction that is often at odds with the world you find yourself in." He glanced at her. "It makes you vulnerable. And it makes you a complication," she finished for him, a faint smile touching her lips. A corner of his mouth twitched. It wasn't a smile, but it was something. "Yes." They walked on, the conversation lulling. The path began to slope upward, away from the formal gardens and toward a wilder, more wooded part of the estate. The air grew cooler, shaded by tall, ancient trees. "This was my sister's favorite place," Leonard said, his voice quieter, softer than she had ever heard it. The admission was so unexpected, so personal that Eliza stopped walking. He didn't have a sister. She would have known. Sarah would have mentioned it. The family was just the Duke and the Dowager. He stopped a few paces ahead, realizing she was no longer beside him. He turned, and the expression on his face made her breath catch. The usual sternness was gone, replaced by a deep, old sadness. You had a sister?" Eliza asked gently. "I did." He looked away toward a small, overgrown clearing where a stone bench sat beneath an old willow tree. "Her name was Clara. She died 10 years ago. Fever." It took her quickly. The pain in his voice was a living thing. Eliza's heart ached for him. This was the source of his reserve, the root of his need for control. The world had become an unpredictable, dangerous place that could take a vibrant young life in an instant. Order was his defense against the chaos of grief. "I am so sorry, Leonard," she whispered. The use of his Christian name was instinctive, a gesture of intimacy and sympathy. She expected him to correct her, to retreat. He didn't. He just stood there, letting her see the raw wound that had never fully healed. "She was like you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. He finally looked at her, his gray eyes clouded with memory. Not in manner. Claire was all laughter and light. She had no filter, no sense of propriety. She would say exactly what was on her mind, much to my father's despair. A genuine, sad smile touched his lips. But she had that same, unwavering certainty about what was right and what was wrong. A moral compass that pointed true north, regardless of the consequences. His gaze intensified, seeing Eliza, but also seeing the ghost of his sister. It is a terrifyingly brave way to move through the world. And a dangerous one. Eliza understood. He wasn't just pushing her away because she was a disruption. He was afraid for her. He had seen what happened to a woman who defied convention, who felt too deeply. The world had punished Clara for it. He was trying to punish Eliza into conformity to keep her safe. The realization was a thunderclap. His coldness, his criticism, it was a perverse form of protection. Tears pricked her eyes again, but this time they were not tears of humiliation or self-pity. They were tears of profound understanding. She walked toward him slowly until she was standing right before him. "Thank you," she said softly, "for telling me." He gave a short, jerky nod, visibly wrestling his emotions back under control. The Duke was reasserting himself, but the wall was thinner now. She had seen the foundation it was built upon. "Your fever," he said, changing the subject, though his voice was still uncharacteristically gentle. "You said it changed you. Made the world seem sharper." It was her turn to offer a piece of herself. She nodded, looking down at her hands. It was like waking up from a long sleep. The things I had once accepted without question suddenly seemed arbitrary. I saw the world not as a series of rules to be followed, but of people to be understood. She was weaving her modern perspective into the lie, creating a truth he could accept. "I suppose it made me less compliant." "It made you more," he said. When she looked up, puzzled, he clarified. "More everything. More frustrating. More confusing. More," he trailed off, but the unspoken word hung in the air between them. "More captivating." The silence that followed was comfortable, charged with a new, profound intimacy. They had shared vulnerabilities. They had offered apologies and accepted them. The battlefield between them had been cleared, and in its place was a fragile, tentative bridge. They began to walk back toward the manor, the setting sun casting long shadows through the trees. The air between them was easier now, the tension replaced by a quiet, mutual recognition. "So," Eliza said a little daringly, "does this mean I am permitted to have opinions?" "Within reason, of course." He let out a sound that was almost a laugh. "I would not go that far. But you may express them. To me. In private. Where I can ensure they do not cause you irreparable harm." It was a concession. A massive one. And it was laced with a possessiveness that made her shiver. "And what of my shuffling?" she asked, a genuine smile touching her lips for the first time that day. "Shall I demonstrate it for you?" He stopped walking and looked down at her, a real, full smile finally breaking through his reserve. It transformed his face, lighting his eyes and softening the stern lines around his mouth. He was devastatingly handsome. "I think," he said, his voice warm with amusement, "that is one demonstration I can live without." They stood there for a moment, smiling at each other like fools, the setting sun painting everything in gold. The struggle wasn't over. There were still oceans of secrets between them. But for the first time Eliza felt a flicker of hope. Not that she could go home, but that she might somehow be able to build a new one here. With him. The trust had been given and it had been accepted. It was a fragile thing, but it was a start. And for now it was enough. Chapter 8. The Almost Kiss. The fragile bridge of trust built in the garden did not lead to a sudden, sweeping romance. Life at Ashworth Manor did not transform into a whirlwind of stolen glances and secret trysts. Instead, it settled into a new, profoundly different rhythm, one that was both exhilarating and utterly terrifying for Eliza. Leonard no longer avoided her. Their paths crossed with a new frequency that felt deliberate, though he would never admit it. He began to join her and his mother for tea with a regularity that made the dowager raise her eyebrows but hold her tongue. The conversations were no longer battlegrounds but explorations. He would pose a question about a book, a current event, an abstract point of philosophy, and genuinely listen to her response, his gray eyes intent and thoughtful. He still argued, of course. He was, at his core, a man who loved the structure of a good debate. But the edge of condescension was gone, replaced by a genuine curiosity. He was, Eliza realized, trying to understand the map of her mind. In return, she learned the contours of his. She saw the fierce intelligence that governed his every action, the deep sense of responsibility that was both his greatest strength and his prison. She saw the dry, unexpected wit that could surface when he was relaxed, usually aimed at his mother's more outlandish pronouncements, and once breathtakingly at himself. They found common ground in the library. It became their neutral territory, a silent testament to their fledgling connection. He would often be there in the late afternoons, and she began to gravitate there at the same time. They didn't always speak. Sometimes he would be at his desk reviewing estate papers, and she would simply choose a book from the shelves and read in a chair by the window, the silence between them a comfortable shared thing. It was during one of these quiet afternoons that it happened. The rain was pattering softly against the window panes, casting a gray, intimate light through the room. Leonard was not at his desk but standing before the shelves that housed his collection of history texts. Eliza was looking for something new to read, her fingers trailing along the spines of novels on the opposite side of the room. Her eyes fell on a familiar worn leather volume tucked between a bulky history of Rome and a treatise on agricultural rotation. It was the book of poetry. Dawn and Marvel. Leonard Bailey. Her heart gave a little leap. She hadn't seen it since that first day. She stood on her toes, reaching for it, wanting to feel the soft leather under her fingers again, to revisit the passionate words that so contrasted with the man she was coming to know. At the exact same moment, a shadow fell over her. Leonard had come to retrieve the same history text from the shelf above it. Their movements were synchronized. Her hand closed around the poetry book just as his reached for the one above it. Their arms brushed, a whisper of contact through the layers of their clothing. They both froze. Eliza slowly lowered back onto her heels, the book clutched to her chest. Leonard's hand remained on the shelf above her head, effectively caging her in. He looked down at the volume in her hands, his expression unreadable. "You are interested in metaphysics, Lady Eleanor?" he asked, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in the quiet room. I find the complexity of the arguments engaging," she said, her own voice breathless. She was achingly aware of his proximity, the heat of his body so close to hers, the scent of sandalwood and rain that clung to him. "Do you?" It wasn't a question. He was looking at her, not the book. His gaze was intense, searching. "I would have thought you preferred more modern sentiments." "Sometimes the oldest sentiments are the most modern," she countered softly, her courage returning. "The way Dawn writes of love, it is not simple or sweet. It is a force of nature. An intellectual and spiritual union. It's overwhelming." He was watching her lips as she spoke, his eyes darkening. The air between them grew thick, charged with a tension that had been building for weeks. The gentle patter of the rain was the only sound in the world. "Overwhelming," he repeated, the word a husky whisper. He leaned in slightly, his free hand coming up to rest on the shelf beside her head, closing the small space between them completely. "Do you find overwhelming things appealing, Lady Eleanor?" Eliza's heart was hammering so violently she was sure he could hear it. Her breath caught in her throat. This was not a debate. This was something else entirely. This was the precipice. I find that which is real to be appealing, Your Grace, she whispered, her eyes locked on his. Even when it is overwhelming. The use of his title in that moment, with her body trapped between his arms and her voice full of unspoken challenge, was the most intimate thing she had ever said. Something in his expression shattered. The last vestiges of control, of careful distance, evaporated. The look in his eyes was pure, unadulterated hunger. The storm she had always sensed within him was finally breaking free. Eleanor, he breathed, and her name on his lips was a prayer and a surrender. He leaned in. She leaned in. The world narrowed to the space between their mouths. She could feel the warmth of his breath on her skin, see the flecks of silver in his gray eyes, the faint shadow of stubble along his jaw. The poetry book was a forgotten barrier against her chest. Her eyes fluttered closed. They were a breath apart. The kiss was an inevitability, a culmination of every argument, every glance, every moment of misunderstood connection. It was going to happen. The library door swung open with a soft creak. Your Grace? The steward from the North Farm is here with the reports you requested. Mr. Higgs, the butler, stood in the doorway, his expression as impassive as ever. The spell shattered. Leonard jerked back as if he'd been shot, his face draining of all emotion. The shutters slammed down so fast it was dizzying. The vulnerable, hungry man was gone, replaced by the cold, impenetrable Duke. Eliza stumbled back a step, her face flaming with a mixture of desire and crushing humiliation. She clutched the poetry book like a shield. Leonard didn't look at her. He turned to the butler, his voice clipped and perfectly calm. Thank you, Higgs. Show him into my study. I will be there directly. Very good, Your Grace. Higgs bowed and withdrew, closing the door softly behind him, utterly unaware of the cataclysm he had just interrupted. The silence he left behind was deafening. Leonard stood with his back to her for a long moment, his shoulders rigid. When he finally turned, his expression was one of such cold, stark horror that it felt like a physical blow. He wasn't looking at her with desire or even confusion. He was looking at her as if she were a manifestation of his greatest failure. That was... He stopped, his voice strangled. He cleared his throat, forcing out the words. That was an unforgivable lapse. The word lapse was like a dash of ice water. He made it sound like a mistake in accounting, an error in judgment. Leonard, she began, her voice trembling. Do not, he cut her off, the words sharp as glass. Do not say my name. He took a step back, putting a vast, uncrossable distance between them in the small space. It seems I have misread the situation. I have given you a false impression. Each word was a deliberate, cruel stab. Eliza felt the fragile hope she had nurtured shatter into a million pieces. There was no impression to give, she said, her own voice hardening in defense. You were about to kiss me. I was about to let you. There is no mystery in it. Her bluntness seemed to shock him. A muscle ticked in his jaw. It was a moment of ill-advised proximity. It will not happen again. Why? The question was a challenge flung at him with all the pain and frustration she felt. Because you wanted to? Because you still want to? His eyes flashed with something dangerous. This is precisely the kind of ungoverned emotion I warned you about. This is what happens when one surrenders to feeling. He said the word like a curse. It leads to chaos. To ruin. Ruin, she echoed, a bitter laugh escaping her. What ruin? We are two unattached adults standing in a library. Who, precisely, is being ruined here? You are a lady under my protection, he snapped, his control finally fracturing to reveal the anger and, beneath it, the terror that drove him. My mother's companion. The world does not see a philosophical debate or a moment of mutual understanding. It sees a duke dallying with a woman in a vulnerable position. It would destroy your reputation. It would be a betrayal of the trust your family placed in mine. It would be indefensible. He was building the wall again, brick by brick, using duty and propriety as his mortar. So that is it, she said, her voice flat with defeat. The system once again triumphs over the person. The system protects the person, he insisted, but he wouldn't meet her eyes. He was already retreating mentally and physically, back into the fortress of his title. You will excuse me. I have business to attend to. He turned and walked away without a backward glance. He left her standing there, alone in the silent library, the book of passionate poetry still clutched in her hands. The door clicked shut. Eliza stood frozen for a long moment. Then a tremor ran through her. The book slipped from her numb fingers and landed on the rug with a soft thud. The almost kiss had been the most alive, the most real moment she had experienced since coming to this time. And his rejection in its wake was the most devastating. He hadn't pulled away because he didn't want her. He had pulled away because he did. The depth of his want had terrified him. It was a force he could not control, could not categorize, could not fit into his perfectly ordered world. And so he had to reject it. To reject her. She had seen the man, and for a breathtaking moment he had let himself be seen. But the Duke had returned, and the Duke was afraid of the man's desires. The struggle was no longer between a modern woman and a historical Duke. It was between the man Leonard could be and the Duke he believed he had to be. And Eliza, her heart breaking, knew that she was powerless in that battle. She was just the catalyst, the overwhelming emotion that had to be suppressed. She sank into the chair by the window, drawing her knees up to her chest as the rain continued to fall outside. She felt more alone than she ever had, even in those first terrifying days. Because now she knew what she was missing. Now she knew the taste of his breath, the heat of his want, and the cold, brutal strength of the walls that would always keep it out of reach. Chapter 9: The Withdrawal. The days that followed the almost kiss in the library were a study in exquisite isolation. The fragile connection Eliza had felt, the tentative bridge of trust, hadn't just been dismantled. It had been vaporized. In its place was a void, cold and absolute. Leonard's withdrawal was total and devastatingly efficient. He was a ghost in his own home. He took his meals in his study. He ceased joining them for tea. When their paths did cross, inevitable in the confines of the manor, he was the Duke of Ashworth in his most immaculate, impenetrable form. His greetings were a nod so slight it was barely perceptible. His eyes, when they accidentally met hers, were not just cold, they were empty. As if the man who had almost kissed her had never existed. It was the emptiness that hurt the most. Anger she could have understood. Frustration, even regret. But this was eradication. She was a problem he had solved by simply deleting her from his field of vision. The Dowager Duchess watched this new Cold War with a deepening frown. She tried at first to draw Leonard out. "Leonard, will you not join us? Lady Eleanor was just telling me the most amusing story about a cat she once had." A complete lie. Eliza had been silent for days. "I have correspondence, mother," was his flat, toneless reply before he vanished down a corridor. He tried to coax Eliza. "My dear, you must not mind him. He gets these moods. It is the weight of the dukedom. It will pass." But Eliza knew it was not a mood. It was a verdict. She had been weighed in the scales of his duty and found wanting. No, not wanting, dangerous. The hope that had begun to flower within her withered and turned to ash. The long days of embroidery and reading, once merely tedious, became a form of torture. Every tick of the ornate clock on the mantelpiece was a reminder of the life draining from her, of the endless performance with no audience, no purpose. She was playing a part for a mother who saw too much and a son who refused to see her at all. The loneliness was a physical ache, a hollowed-out feeling in her chest that nothing could fill. She missed her old life with a ferocity that was new, not just her freedom and her career but the simple ability to be known. To have friends who understood her references, her humor, her frustrations. Here she was a ghost in a borrowed body, haunting a life that wasn't hers, invisible to the one person whose sight she craved. One afternoon, a week into the deep freeze, she was sitting with the Dowager in the drawing room. The Dowager was attempting to engage her in a discussion about a new play they had both read, but Eliza's responses were monosyllabic, her gaze fixed on the raindrops tracing paths down the window pane. Amelia set her book down with a soft sigh. "This cannot continue, child." Eliza blinked, dragging her attention back into the room. "I am sorry, Your Grace. My mind was wandering. It has been wandering for days. As has my son's." The Dowager's sharp eyes were full of a pity that made Eliza want to curl into a ball. "He has hurt you." It was not a question. The directness of it stole Eliza's breath. She looked down at her hands clenched in her lap. She could not lie. A tear escaped, tracing a hot path down her cheek. She wiped it away angrily. "I do not understand what I did wrong," Eliza whispered, the words torn from her. It was the closest she could come to the truth. "You did nothing wrong. the Dowager said firmly. You exist. For a man like Leonard, that is sometimes enough. She leaned forward, her voice softening. He is afraid, Eleanor. Of me. The idea was ludicrous. Of what you make him feel, Amelia corrected gently. Leonard has spent a decade building walls around himself. He believes those walls are what keep him safe, what keep this estate running. You have a tendency to appear outside those walls with a ladder he never knew existed. It terrifies him. Eliza thought of the raw hunger in his eyes, followed by the stark horror. The Dowager was right. It was fear. I cannot stop existing, Eliza said, her voice thick with despair. No, my dear. You cannot. The Dowager was silent for a long moment. And so you have a choice. You can stay here in this beautiful gilded cage and slowly fade away, hoping that one day he might be less of a coward. Her tone made it clear what she thought of that option. Or you can choose a different path. Eliza looked up, confused. What other path is there? You are a gentlewoman of good family if limited means, the Dowager said, her tone becoming practical. There are other positions. Other families in need of a companion. Some in London even. A change of scenery, it might be for the best. The suggestion landed like a physical blow. Leave Ashworth? The idea was simultaneously terrifying and tempting. To escape this constant aching reminder of Leonard's rejection. To go somewhere she wasn't known as the quiet Eleanor, where her strangeness might be taken for eccentricity rather than a personal affront to a duke. She could start again. Not as Eliza, but perhaps as a version of Eleanor who was allowed to be a little more herself. But leaving meant giving up. Meant never seeing him again. Never hearing his voice, never arguing with him, never hoping for another glimpse of the man behind the walls. The pain of that thought was even sharper than the pain of his indifference. Yet what was the alternative? To stay and slowly suffocate? To become a permanent ghost in his halls? A sad reminder of a lapse he wished to forget? The decision crystallized within her, cold and clear. He could not live like this. Whether he was afraid or not, he had made his choice. He had chosen his walls. And she refused to be a prisoner of his fear. She took a shaky breath, squaring her shoulders. She looked the Dowager Duchess directly in the eye. You are right, Your Grace, she said, her voice surprisingly steady. A change would be for the best. If you would be so kind. I would be grateful for your assistance in securing a new position. I would like to leave Ashworth Manor. The words felt like shards of glass in her throat, but saying them aloud also brought a strange, numb sense of relief. She was taking agency. She was participating in her own story. The Dowager's face fell slightly as if she had hoped for a different outcome, but she nodded with resolve. Very well, my dear. It will take a few days. I have friends. I will write letters immediately. Your courage does you credit. It is not courage, Eliza said softly, looking back out at the rain. It is self-preservation. She spent the next 2 days in a strange, suspended state. The decision was made, but the reality of it had not yet arrived. She was like a patient awaiting surgery, anxious for the pain to be over, even if the recovery was uncertain. She avoided the library. She walked in the gardens only when she was certain he would not be there. She packed her few belongings, Eleanor's belongings, with a methodical detachment. She saw him only once more. She was coming down the main staircase and he was crossing the marble hall below, heading out. He was dressed for riding, his boots echoing on the stone floor. He must have felt her presence, for he glanced up. Their eyes met. For a fraction of a second, the emptiness in his gaze flickered. Something raw and pained flashed in the gray depths. A shock of recognition, a glimpse of the man trapped inside. It was there and gone so quickly she might have imagined it, replaced by the familiar, cold void. He gave a curt, impersonal nod and turned away, striding out the door without a backward glance. That single, fleeting glance was his only farewell. It was the final confirmation she needed. She had not imagined their connection. He felt it too. And he was choosing every second of every day to reject it. The pain was so acute it was almost peaceful. There was no more hope to be agonized over. It was done. On the morning of the 3rd day, the Dowager summoned her to her private sitting room. It is arranged, Amelia said without preamble. She looked tired. Lady Penworth, a dear friend of mine in Bath, is in need of a companion. She is older, a little deaf and very kind. She will not mind. Well, she will not mind if you are occasionally more interesting than a piece of wallpaper. The dowager tried to smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. You will travel there tomorrow. I have arranged a carriage. Beth. It was far away. A different world. Thank you, Your Grace, Eliza said, her voice a hollow echo. For everything. Your kindness has been. Her words failed her. How could she thank this woman for giving her a future while her heart was breaking over the sun? The dowager stood and took both of Eliza's hands in hers. Her grip was surprisingly strong. You are a remarkable young woman, Eleanor. Wherever you go, whatever you do, remember that. Do not let anyone, not even my stubborn, foolish son, make you forget it. Tears filled Eliza's eyes. She squeezed the dowager's hands, unable to speak, and then fled the room. She spent her last afternoon walking through the gardens one final time, saying a silent goodbye to the places that had become hers. The bench by the stream, the hidden shed, the rose arbor where they had debated freedom and systems. She was leaving behind the only place in this time that had ever felt, however briefly, like it could be a home. He had come to this place a terrified stranger. She was leaving as a heartbroken woman. But she was leaving on her own terms. The struggle for his heart was over. She had lost. Now the struggle was for her own survival. And for the first time since she'd arrived, she was facing it not as Eleanor and not just as Eliza, but as herself. Chapter 10: The Choice. The morning of her departure dawned with a brutal, cheerful clarity. Sunlight streamed into Eliza's bedchamber, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Her single trunk stood by the door, a stark, final punctuation to her time at Ashworth Manor. Sarah helped her dress in silence, her face long with a sadness that felt like a balm and a burden. The maid's tears during their goodbye were genuine, a testament to the real, if small, connection Eliza had forged here. You will write, my lady? Sarah sniffled, fastening the last button on Eliza's traveling dress. If I can, Eliza lied gently. She wouldn't. There was no point. The past was a country she was leaving behind. The finality of it was a heavy stone in her stomach. She felt numb, moving through the motions like a sleepwalker. This was it. The end of the strange, painful, and exhilarating dream. She would go to Bath, to Lady Penworth. She would be a better companion, a quieter Eleanor. She would bury the last remnants of Eliza deep, deep down, where they could never cause her pain again. She descended the stairs for the last time. The Dowager Duchess was waiting for her in the grand hall, her expression a complex mix of regret and resolve. The carriage is ready, my dear, she said, her voice softer than usual. She took Eliza's hands. Be well. And remember what I said. I will, Eliza whispered. Thank you for everything. She could not say his name. She could not ask if he knew. He didn't want to know. His ignorance would be a final kindness. His knowledge a final indifference. Both were unbearable. A footman picked up her trunk. Eliza took a deep, shuddering breath, squaring her shoulders for the last walk through the door, into a new, unknown future. The front door swung open before she could take a step. And there he was. Leonard stood on the threshold, silhouetted against the morning sun, his riding clothes dusty, his hair disheveled as if he had ridden hard. His chest was heaving not from exertion but from raw, unchecked emotion. His face was pale, his eyes wide and wild, stripped of all their icy control. He looked like a man who had seen a ghost, or had finally woken from a long sleep. He stared at her traveling dress, at the trunk in the footman's hands. His gaze snapped to his mother, and a look of utter, betrayed horror crossed his features. What is the meaning of this? He demanded, his voice a ragged scrape. The Dowager Duchess lifted her chin. Lady Eleanor is leaving us, Leonard. She has accepted a new position in Bath. We were just seeing her off. The words seemed to physically strike him. He took an unsteady step back, his hand going to the doorframe to steady himself. He looked back at Eliza, and the pain in his eyes was so acute, so naked, it stole the air from her lungs. No, he said, the word a low, desperate plea. No. You cannot go. The hall was frozen. The footman stood rigid, the trunk forgotten in his hands. The dowager watched, her eyes sharp and anxious. Eliza found her voice, though it trembled. It is for the best, Your Grace. The formality seemed to galvanize him. He strode into the hall, dismissing the footman and his mother with a sharp, "Leave us." The command was not that of a duke, but of a man pushed to the very edge of his endurance. The dowager hesitated for only a second before ushering the stunned footman away, pulling the great door shut behind them, leaving Eliza alone with Leonard in the vast, silent hall. The moment they were alone, the fierce energy seemed to drain from him. He stood before her, his shoulders slumping, his head bowed. He looked utterly defeated. "You cannot go," he repeated, his voice hollow. "Please." "Why?" The question was a whisper torn from the deepest part of her. "You have made it abundantly clear that my presence here is unwelcome." He flinched as if she'd struck him. He finally lifted his head, and the look in his eyes was one of utter self-loathing. "Unwelcome? God, Eleanor, whoever you are, your presence is the only thing in this damned house that has felt real to me in a decade." She could only stare, her heart hammering against her ribs. "I have been a coward," he said, the words rushing out of him raw and unvarnished. "A fool. I have hidden behind duty and propriety because I am terrified." He took a step toward her, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. "That day in the library. I have never wanted anything in my life the way I wanted to kiss you. It was an obliteration. Of my control, of my reason, of every damned rule I have ever lived by. And it terrified me." He was admitting it. He was laying himself bare, the walls not just cracked but demolished. "So you punished me for it," she said, her own pain rising to the surface. "You looked through me as if I were made of glass." "I was punishing myself," he cried, his voice breaking. "Every time I saw you I felt it again. That obliteration. I thought if I could push you away, if I could make you hate me, the feeling would stop. But it only grew stronger. This morning, when Higgs told me you were leaving, it was like being told the sun would not rise." He closed the distance between them, stopping just short of touching her. His eyes, those stormy gray eyes, were pleading, desperate. "I do not understand you," he confessed, his voice raw with emotion. "I do not understand your strange words, your radical ideas, your fearless heart. I do not understand how a fever could change a woman so completely. And I don't care." Eliza's breath caught. You don't care?" "I care only about the woman standing before me now," he said, his gaze intense, devouring her. "The woman who argues with dukes and saves children's hands and looks at the world as if it could be made new. The woman who sees the man behind the title and is not afraid of him, even when he is afraid of himself." He reached out then, his hand trembling slightly as he cupped her cheek. His touch was warm, real, anchoring her to the spot. "I love you," he whispered, the words simple, stark, and utterly devastating. "It is a completely illogical, inconvenient, and overwhelming truth. And I am done fighting it. Stay. Please. Do not leave me to my ordered, empty hell. Stay and argue with me and disrupt my household and overwhelm me. For the rest of my days." It was the confession she had never dared to hope for. It was everything. And it changed nothing. The truth, her impossible, horrifying truth, now stood between them like a mountain. He was offering his heart to Eleanor, but it was Eliza he loved. He didn't know the woman he loved was a ghost, a trespasser from another time. Tears streamed down her face. She leaned into his touch for a moment, savoring its warmth, knowing it would be the last time. "You love a woman who does not exist," she said, her voice thick with grief. He frowned, his thumb stroking her cheek. "What are you saying?" This was it. The moment of no return. She could lie, accept his love under false pretenses and live a beautiful lie. Or she could tell the truth and destroy it all. She thought of Clara, of his fear of chaos, of his need for order. She loved him too much to build their life on a foundation of lies. She took a step back, breaking the contact. The loss of his touch was a physical pain. "The fever did not change me, Leonard," she said, her voice surprisingly steady despite her tears. "It killed me." He stared at her, confusion and dawning alarm in his eyes. "Eleanor, what?" "My name is Eliza," she interrupted, the words rushing out now. "I am not from this time. I am not from this world. I died in my time, in the future, and I woke up in this body. In Eleanor's body. She is gone. I am a transplant. A soul out of time." The words sounded insane even to her own ears. She watched the confusion on his face harden into disbelief, then into a kind of horrified shock. He took a step back, his hand falling to his side. "You are unwell," he said, his voice low and shaken. "The stress of leaving, You are not thinking clearly. I have never thought more clearly, she insisted, her heart breaking with every word. Think, Leonard. The things I say, the things I know. Medicine. Philosophy. The way I speak to you. Do you truly believe a quiet, overlooked companion from a minor noble family could be this? She gestured to herself, to the woman who had argued and loved and challenged him. I am a mistake. A miracle. I don't know. But I am not her. The woman you love is a lie. She had given him the truth, the whole, unbelievable truth. And she watched as the love in his eyes was slowly replaced by a storm of confusion, betrayal, and utter bewilderment. He looked at her as if he had never seen her before. The silence that followed was the most agonizing of her life. She had destroyed it. She had chosen truth over love, and now she had neither. He turned away from her, running a hand through his hair, his shoulders tense. He was grappling with the impossible. She could see the struggle in the rigid line of his back. The rational Duke trying to process the irrational, the man who loved her trying to reconcile the woman with the story. She couldn't bear it. He had to leave. No. She turned toward the door, her vision blurred with tears. This was the true end. Wait. His voice stopped her. It was not the voice of the Duke. It was not the voice of the terrified man. It was something new. Something raw and quiet and utterly certain. She turned back. He was looking at her, and the confusion was still there, but it was being burned away by a dawning, awe-filled acceptance. It does not matter, he said, each word deliberate, weighted with meaning. Eliza shook her head, not understanding. What? It does not matter, he repeated, crossing the space between them in 2 long strides. He took her face in his hands, his grip firm, forcing her to look at him. You could tell me you fell from the moon on a beam of starlight and it would not matter. The soul standing before me, the mind that challenges me, the heart that cares so fiercely it frightens me. That is what I love. Not a name. Not a history. Not a body. His thumbs stroked her cheeks, his eyes searching hers with a desperate intensity. Do you understand? I love the you that is in there. However you came to be here. The world tilted on its axis. He believed her. Not only did he believe her, he was choosing her. The truth, instead of pushing him away, had finally obliterated the last of his walls. You believe me, she whispered, hardly daring to hope. I believe you, he said, emphasizing the word. I have always believed in you. I was just too much of a fool to admit it. A real, genuine smile, full of wonder and relief, broke through his anguish. You are my beautiful, impossible mystery. And I do not want to solve you. I just want to love you. A sob of pure, unadulterated joy escaped her. He pulled her to him, crushing her against his chest, his arms wrapping around her so tightly she could feel the frantic beating of his heart against hers. She clung to him, burying her face in the rough wool of his coat, breathing in the scent of him, sandalwood, horses, and home. He leaned back, cupping her face again, his eyes shining with tears of his own. Stay, he whispered, his voice full of awe and promise. Stay with me. Be my Duchess. Argue with me every day for the rest of our lives. Overwhelm me. Eliza looked up at this man, this Duke, this beautiful, complicated soul who had chosen her truth over his own reality. The struggle was over. Not with a surrender, but with a choice. His choice. Her choice. Their choice. Yes, she breathed, her heart so full it felt like it would burst. Yes. And finally, after a journey across centuries, after a battle of wills and hearts, his lips found hers. It was not a hesitant almost kiss. It was a claiming, a promise, a sealing of their impossible, incredible fate. It was the end of one story and the breathtaking beginning of another. Together. Bonus chapter. A truth for a truth. The study was bathed in the soft, golden light of a dying fire. The deep red of the rug and the rich brown of the leather-bound books seemed to glow from within, creating a world of warmth and shadow that shut out the crisp autumn night beyond the windows. Eliza, no longer Lady Eleanor but the Duchess of Ashworth, sat curled in a large wing-back chair, her feet tucked beneath her, a book open but unread on her lap. Her gaze was fixed on her husband. Leonard sat at his desk, his brow furrowed in concentration as he reviewed a stack of estate papers. The quill in his hand moved with quick, precise strokes, the scratch of nib on parchment a familiar, comforting sound. He had shed his coat and waistcoat, his shirt sleeves rolled up to his elbows, revealing the strong, corded forearms of a man who was as comfortable on horseback as he was in a ledger. This was him at his most unguarded, the Duke in his sanctum, the weight of his responsibilities a mantle he wore with innate grace. A soft smile touched Eliza's lips. Months of marriage had not dulled the wonder of it all. The sheer, staggering fact of his love was a constant, warm ember in her chest. He knew her truth, the impossible, terrifying truth of her origin, and it had not fractured his love, it had deepened it. She was no longer a mystery to be solved, but a partner in a shared, secret life. He must have felt her gaze, for he looked up. The stern focus in his gray eyes softened immediately, transforming into a warmth that was for her and her alone. "You are staring, Duchess," he said, a faint, playful note in his voice. "Is my accounting so very fascinating?" "Infinitely," she replied, her smile widening. "I was just thinking how very ducal you look. It's quite intimidating." He set down his quill and leaned back in his chair, stretching his arms above his head. "I shall have to try harder to be less intimidating for my wife, then. Perhaps I should take up juggling." The image of the stern, proper Duke of Ashworth attempting to juggle was so absurd that Eliza let out a laugh, the sound bright and clear in the quiet room. "I would pay good money to see that. I have no doubt." His own smile was easy, relaxed. This was a side of him few ever saw, the man beneath the title capable of humor and a deep, abiding peace. A peace she knew that he had found with her. His expression grew more thoughtful as he watched her. "What were you really thinking?" She sighed, her smile turning tender. "I was thinking how lucky I am. How happy I am." She gestured around the room at the fire at him. "This. All of it. It still feels like a dream sometimes." He rose from his desk and came to her, lowering himself onto the footstool before her chair. He took her hands in his thumbs tracing circles on her palms. His touch, as always, sent a thrill of warmth through her. "It is no dream," he said, his voice low and earnest. "It is the most real thing I have ever known." He brought one of her hands to his lips and pressed a soft kiss to her knuckles. "You are the most real thing I have ever known." Tears pricked at Eliza's eyes. She had spent so long feeling like a ghost, an imposter. His unwavering certainty was the anchor that kept her grounded in this time, in this life. "I want to tell you something," she said suddenly, the words coming from a place of deep need. "Something about my time. About me." He stilled, his gaze intensifying. He never pressed her for details. Understanding the sheer strangeness of it was a burden. But he always listened, rapt, when she offered them. "You know you can tell me anything." She took a deep breath. "Where I come from, women are not companions or ornaments. They have careers. They are doctors, lawyers, artists, rulers of companies." She saw the flicker of astonishment in his eyes but pressed on. "I had a career. I was a graphic designer." "Eh, what?" he asked, frowning slightly. She laughed softly. "It is an artist of a sort. But for commerce. I created images and words to sell things, to tell stories. I had my own small flat. I owned my own carriage," she said, using the closest term she could think of for a car. "I answered to no one. I was independent." She watched him process this, trying to fit the image of the woman he knew into this radically different context. The idea of female independence on such a scale was not just foreign to him. It was revolutionary. "It sounds," he began, searching for the word. "Overwhelming." "It was normal," she said gently. "It was my life. And I loved it. I was good at it. I was someone. Before I woke up here and became no one." He flinched at that, his grip on her hands tightening. "You are not no one. You are my wife. You are the Duchess of Ashworth. You are the woman who saved a boy's hand and argues with me over tenant rights and fills this house with a light it has not seen since my sister was alive." "I know," she said quickly, seeing the hurt in his eyes. "I know who I am to you. And I would not change it. Not for anything." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. "But that woman, Eliza, the designer with her own life and her own car, she is still in here. And sometimes I miss her. I miss the freedom. I miss the agency." He had finally said it. The secret fear she had been carrying, that a part of her would always mourn the life she had lost, even as she cherished the one she had gained. She expected confusion. Perhaps even a flicker of jealousy or insecurity. Instead he looked at her with a deep, profound understanding. "Of course you do," he said, his voice rough with empathy. "It is who you are. It is part of the fierce, beautiful heart that I fell in love with. You cannot simply cut it out." He brought her hand to his chest, holding it over his heart. "I would not want you to." Tears spilled down her cheeks. His acceptance was a gift she would never stop being grateful for. "Tell me more," he urged softly. "Tell me about your flat. Your work." And so she did. She told him about her tiny apartment with its view of the city lights, about her computer and the magic of creating something from nothing, about the thrill of a successful project, about the freedom of walking down a street anonymously, a coffee in her hand answerable to no one. He listened, utterly captivated, asking questions that were both naive and deeply insightful. He struggled with concepts like the internet and smartphones, but he understood the core of what she was describing: a life of purpose and self-determination. When she finished, the fire had burned low. The room was quiet, filled with the weight of her shared truth. He was silent for a long time, just holding her hand against his heart. Finally he spoke. "I cannot give you that world back," he said, his voice full of a quiet regret. "But I can give you agency in this one." She looked at him, puzzled. "What do you mean?" "The tenant reforms you proposed for the South Farm," he said, his eyes alight with a new idea. "The new irrigation system, the profit-sharing model. I've been studying them. They are radical. They are also brilliant." Her breath caught. You think so?" "I know so," he stated. "And I have decided to implement them. Not as my idea. As yours." Eliza stared at him, stunned. "Leonard, you can't. The others, the neighboring landowners, they will think you've gone mad. Or that I am a meddling." "I do not care what they think," he interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. It was the Duke's voice, but used in her service. "You are the Duchess of Ashworth. Your ideas have merit. You will present them to the steward and the farm manager next week. You will oversee the project." He was giving her a job. A purpose. Not as a companion or a wife, but as a partner. He was carving out a space for her, not just in his heart but in his world. "You would do that?" "For me?" she whispered, her heart overflowing. "It is not for you," he corrected, a slow smile spreading across his face. "It is for the estate. It is a sound investment. It is merely a happy coincidence that it also makes my wife feel independent." He was teasing her, but his eyes were serious. He meant it. He believed in her. She launched herself from the chair and into his arms, knocking him backward onto the rug in a tangle of limbs and laughter. She kissed him, pouring all her love, her gratitude, her joy into the kiss. He held her tightly, laughing against her lips. "Is this a common practice in the future? Assaulting one's husband with gratitude?" "Only when he is exceptionally wonderful," she murmured, kissing him again. Later, as they lay together on the rug before the fire, wrapped in each other and a shared blanket, Eliza felt a sense of wholeness she had never known was possible. The two parts of her soul, the modern woman and the historical duchess, were not at war. They were being woven together, thread by thread, into a new, stronger tapestry. She had given him her truth, and in return he had given her a future. Not just as his wife but as herself. She looked up at him, tracing the line of his jaw. "I love you, Leonard Bailey." He turned his head and pressed a kiss into her palm, his stormy gray eyes soft in the firelight. "And I you, Eliza. However you came to me, whenever you are from, you are my home."